Welcome to the Dirty Little Dozen, a conversation on the 5th edition PMBOK. My name is Rachel Burrell, and I'm with ESI International. In these videos, we'll explore the differences between the 4th and 5th editions, section by section. Here with me today is Joe Czarnecki from ESI's Product Strategy team. The new PMBOK just came out. What are we looking at as users of the manual?
As a matter of fact, yes, it did come out just in January of 2013, copyright date January 2013, and the manual is up to 589 pages. Huge. It's up to 47 processes from 42, and after reading the book, there's about 7 major areas of change, from consistency to stakeholder engagement. As a matter of fact, there's a new knowledge area in stakeholders and stakeholder management. Another change is the interpersonal skills of the project manager, which we'll get into in another little video. There's been an increased emphasis on a standard for project management, which they refer to as Annex A1. There's a completely new glossary. There's a key benefit or a key purpose now for every single process and every single process group. And overall, they did a really good job, at least in my opinion, of making the manual easier to read, easier to understand, and less vague. So what did they use for inputs to some of these changes? Well, they did a whole bunch of review and looking at various different elements to make it very consistent. So the standard for program management and the standard for portfolio management are now very consistent with the PMBOK guide. They also recently have been working with the ISO group to create the guidelines for project management, or the ISO 21500. They also took a little bit of input from the Association for Project Management from the UK, as well as the International Project Management Association, or the IPMA. PMI has also recently released a project management lexicon, or a glossary, so to speak, of all of their terms, and that's now consistent across all of their manuals. They also took a look at the various new approaches that have come up recently, from agile project management to theory of constraints, critical chain management, and critical path management. So all of those are the areas that have changed within the PMBOK. A lot to cover, and a lot of really good stuff in there. So first, let's take a look at what they did to the intro. Now let's look into each of the various chapters. In the Introduction to Project Management chapter, they really beefed up the elements of communications with stakeholders and managing stakeholders. They've also changed the content and the description around the relationship between projects, programs, portfolios, and they're calling that organizational project management. They've increased knowledge and information around business value, and they have greatly increased the interpersonal skills that the project manager needs to use. In the 4th edition, it was under Appendix G. Now it's up in the introduction, as well as one of the appendices in the back. But they've added some more interpersonal skills necessary for the project manager, from trust building to coaching and mentoring, and conflict management and conflict resolution. In Chapter 2, where they're talking about the organizational influence on project management, they've swapped the order of this chapter. They wanted to make sure that they talked about the cultural awareness and global and virtual nature of teams, and the role that the project manager needs to play, as well as how to structure the team before they get into the influences on project management, from governance and stakeholder management to the newer life cycles, being agile, which they're calling adaptive, and then they also have the iterative cycles and the predictive life cycles, which is kind of like the waterfall, so to speak. And they've done a pretty good job of coming up with some project success criteria, and the fact that the project manager is the one who's supposed to be able to do that. And this moves us into Chapter 3, about the PM processes. In Chapter 3, in the old edition, was a very confusing chapter. They tried to explain a lot about the different processes and how the processes all fit together and work together. They cleared all of that out. All of the individual steps in the processes are now what they're calling the Annex A1. That's the standard for project management, as referred to by PMI. What's left in Chapter 3 now is a really good discussion around the process groups. Each of the process groups now has a very specific, identifiable key purpose, and they've done a good job at explaining the differences between the type of project information that's out there. being work performance data, which is just raw data about the status of the project. The work performance information, which is an analysis of that raw data in context with what's going on. And then finally, the third element in work performance is around reports. And that's just purely a report. So that's really the overview of what's happening in the PMBOK guide at a high level in the brush and the general context of what's happening in the project world.
I understand that integration hasn't changed a lot. Has anything in the project charter and project management plan changed?
You're right, Rachel. Project integration management hasn't changed that much. There are some key changes, though. They've really intensified and brought out the integrative nature of project management and how everything really ties together. There's a dependency on every element here, from looking at risk right at the very beginning all the way through to ensuring that your stakeholders get the right project information at the very end. So let's take a look at this step by step, because there's not a lot of changes, but we'll look at each of the different processes. First, in developing a project charter, overall they've changed the word contract to agreement, just because there's more than just contracts out there that you have to pay attention to in procurement management. They've added a new technique throughout the PMBOK about facilitation, and they have a bit more information on the charter. For example, they've developed or established and said what the minimum requirements are for a project charter, and that is that you have to set the boundaries for the project. That's the minimum requirement for the project charter. And that's actually mentioned in Develop the Project Management Plan, which really brings out the iterative nature of project management. After that, the direct and managed project work hasn't really changed at all. Monitoring and controlling work, they brought out the idea of using forecasting data to help make decisions, and an analytical technique such as regression analysis. What else? Well, in monitoring and controlling work area, they've really built up the knowledge significantly in the content on monitoring and controlling. And finally, well, not finally, but in the next process, perform integrated change control, they've really highlighted the value of making sure the communications is correct, and around the disposition of the changes to the stakeholders, to make sure that the stakeholders understand what happened to the change requests that they have submitted or brought forth to you as a project manager. They've also increased the role and brought up more information around how the change control board can actually help in change management. And finally, the final process group here, close project or phase, very minor, grammatical changes only, just make it read a little bit easier. That's all.
PMI has created a new process in the scope management knowledge area. How does that impact what we do?
A little bit. The new process is actually called Plan Scope Management, and it's new to the 5th edition from the 4th. But if you've been around a while, you'll notice that it's actually brought back from the 3rd edition. The outputs of this one are a scope management plan and a requirements management plan. Let's step back a minute and talk about project scope management as the way PMI looks at it. Basically for the same as what you're used to from the 4th edition, but PMI has now said that project scope is sometimes viewed as including product scope. So you have to keep both of those in mind as you begin to look at them. The second process, collect requirements, they've added some information to help out with the agile world, where you're using user stories, agile techniques, and benchmarking to help collect the requirements and get exactly what you need and make sure that you get your stakeholders' needs documented correctly. Defined scope is basically the same, very minor changes there. The next process is called create, the work breakdown structure. One thing to note about the work breakdown structure in this 5th edition is it's no longer a deliverable-oriented hierarchical breakdown, etc., etc., etc. They just refer to it as a hierarchical breakdown. So they've taken out the fact that it needs to be deliverable-oriented or product-oriented or phase-oriented. It's simply a hierarchical decomposition of the work. They've also changed it a little bit. One of the outputs, they're now calling a scope baseline, which contains the work breakdown structure and the work breakdown structure dictionary, or the WBS dictionary. Therefore, as you look through the book, you won't see the WBS as a specific output under the create the WBS, because it's tied under the scope baseline. The 5th process is validate scope. It used to be called verify scope, because it's not just about accepting deliverables, but it's about validating that the deliverables will deliver to the expectations and the requirements necessary. Other than that, this process may have a couple grammar changes and things like that. And the same goes with control scope. Very minor changes, not much to talk about there. Thanks.
PMI has created a new process in the time management knowledge area. How does that impact what we do?
Another new process. This is just like the one that we mentioned under project scope management. It's around plan schedule management, and it's how to manage the schedule throughout the life of the project. Predominantly, what they're trying to do here is to make sure that every knowledge area has a subsidiary plan inside the project management plan. That's what they're trying to do. That's the first element there, because they're trying to really ensure that you can establish a level of accuracy, control limits, thresholds, and other elements like that within the schedule management, so you can figure out and determine how best to manage your schedule throughout the life of the project. The second of the 7 processes in time is around defining activities, and it's really minor. They've really minor changes there. Same with sequencing activities, or sequence activities. They deleted a couple of templates in here, but changes are very minor. The 4th process is estimating activity resources. One of the big things I thought they did a really good job at is really develop the awareness of risks and using the risk register as an input around your resources. What are the risks with your resources? The next process is estimating activity durations. Their key point here is to make sure you think about the global nature of your team and around whether it's co-located or a virtual team, and to talk a little bit about group decision-making techniques in this area. Very minor changes elsewise, nothing really show-stopping in this area. In the next process around developing schedule, they've had a lot of input items here. You'll want to check out the PMBOK guide for that. Predominantly looking at the communication channels and the value of communications, as well as a new technique they're calling resource optimization, which includes the old familiar resource leveling, and this new process or new technique called resource smoothing. And this is about smoothing out your resources without changing the critical path. The final process in this knowledge area is control schedule. And they've done a good job at retying this all back into the integrated change control, as with all of the control elements. One note, they've made some changes to each of the processes that happen in the monitoring and controlling process group to focus on control schedule to help visualize that tie-in back into integrated change control. They've also included a couple of shout-outs in this area to look at trend analysis, critical path management, critical chain management, and earned value management techniques. That's it.
So Joe, tell me, what's new in project cost management?
Actually, very little has changed in the cost or the project cost management knowledge area. They've added a new process. It's called plan cost management, just to help you develop a cost management plan, which does what it's supposed to, another subsidiary plan of the project management plan. The rest of the process groups, from estimating cost to defining your budget to controlling your costs, they have all changed a little bit as far as the inputs, the tools and techniques and outputs, just to help them realign. Under the estimating cost, though, they've got a couple of new words. The old PERT technique, they're now calling it beta distribution. The 3-point estimating formula, they're now calling a triangular distribution. Small changes. In the determined budget, they're including a lot more risk, so you can think about risk, and they're bringing that out and making it more forward in what you're doing, specifically around reserves and reserve management. And finally, in control costs, one of the new outputs here is cost forecasts, which come from your earned value management and the TCPI index, as well as doing a full reserve analysis and what that really looks for.
I understand that quality hasn't changed a lot. Can you share insight into what has changed?
Certainly. Project quality management hasn't changed that much. What they've done is really cleaned up the tools and techniques, and aligned them a lot better to make them make sense. They've done a better job at integrating quality into the areas of scope, time, requirements, performance improvement, all that stuff as well. In the first process of quality, called Plan Quality Management, it's been a title change, and they've done that to better tie into requirements and to also identify that this fits into one of the subsidiary plans of the PMP, or Project Management Plan. The second area, Perform Quality Assurance. Very little change here. What they've done is really to provide more information on the quality assurance's role to build confidence, prevent defects, and to identify continuous improvement areas across the project. And finally, in Control Quality, all they've done here is really change the title.
Is it true that PMI has taken a bigger focus on the soft skills needed to lead project teams? And how does a project manager's role change?
Absolutely. PMI has, in this edition of the PMBOK, has dramatically increased the attention and detail and focus on soft skills, which they're calling interpersonal skills. Throughout, and you'll see this time and time again throughout the entire manual. Within Project Human Resource Management, let's take a look at each of the different processes and how they might have changed, or how they have changed. First one is Project Human Resource Management. Here they are really looking at clarifying your roles and responsibilities, developing project organizational charts so you can identify where people fit, and really cataloging and documenting a timetable for when you need staff, your staff acquisition, and release of that personnel. The next process is Acquire Project Team. And here it remains basically unchanged, but they've brought in this idea of a multi-criteria decision analysis to help you identify and choose the appropriate team members. Some of the criteria are availability, the cost of the resource, the expertise they bring, the ability, knowledge, and skills that they have, the attitude that they have toward your project and working with you. And then finally, some international factors, such as the culture and the style and behavior of the global community that we now work. The third area is to develop a project team. And here, PMI has introduced a lot of the information around rewarding and recognition that project managers should do with their project teams. In the past, this has been a conundrum because project managers typically don't feel they have the authority to reward their team members. But this provides some insight and some guidance on some simple ways that team members can be rewarded. Another area they've added into Develop Your Project Team is the value of the use of personal assessment tools, specifically in the area of things like the Strength Deployment Inventory, or the SDI, that you might have seen in ESI's Project Leadership Management and Communications course, or the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Those are a couple of the common tools out there to help with personal assessment. The final process in Project Human Resource Management is managing project teams. Basically, this one's unchanged. They did, however, add one small output to make sure that to remind you to perform team member assessments. And that's just to make sure that you're being nice to your team members and providing valuable information back to their line manager for their annual performance appraisal.
From a quick review, it seems that PMI has split the old communication management into two areas. Is this true?
Absolutely. The Project Communications Management knowledge area that you remember out of the 4th edition has literally been split in two. And part of it's gone to Project Communications Management, stay there. The other part has gone into a new knowledge area that we'll get to in another video called Project Stakeholder Management. Within Project Communication Management now, within the 5th edition, it's been cleaned up and there's a lot more focus on project level communications. So the first process in this group is now called Plan Communications Management. Yes, they've changed the title of it. Really, all they did was make some minor changes to what was there to incorporate all the other changes and align everything within the PMBOK. You still develop the communications plan out of there and what you're supposed to. The next process is Managed Communications. This is a new process. Actually, it appears new. And this is really to get efficient and effective communications flow into, out of, and around the project itself. So they talk a lot more about communication models and techniques. They also talk about how to go about planning your communications so that you can get a better approach to the communication plan development. And finally, the third area here is Control Communications, where the goal is to ensure optimal flow of information. And really, it's looking at what do you do with classified information and how do you deal with classified information, who talks to whom when for public relations or media placements, and then what do you do about archiving documentation. All of this is explained under controlled communications.
I understand that risk hasn't changed a lot. Can you share insight into what has changed?
Certainly. Project risk management has not changed much at all. Out of the 6 areas, there's only about 3 that have any changes. The rest we're not even really going to talk about. So the first is plan risk management. Basically, all they've done is added a little bit around the analytical techniques that you can use with your stakeholders and developing a stakeholder risk profile. That is, what is their appetite and their tolerance to risk? Is it something they're comfortable with or not? That's what you're looking to determine here. The next one is identify risks. And here, they actually include human resource management plan as an example, as a place for risks. That wasn't there before, even though everyone knows that one of the biggest risks in your project are your team members. When they're coming on, are you able to get a hold of them? Do they have the right skills? Now it's actually formally identified in the PMBOK. The third area, perform qualitative risk analysis. They just cleaned up some grammar and made a couple of other changes to tie it in. That goes the same for perform quantitative risk analysis. They just made it a little bit cleaner. And then the final 2, plan risk responses. Very, very, very minor changes here, nothing to be concerned about. And then finally, control risks. They've changed the title to align with the rest of the processes that are in the monitoring and controlling process group. Other than that, very minor. Risks stayed basically the same.
I don't see too many changes in procurement management. Can you talk about what the changes are?
Certainly. This is another area, much like risk, that has changed very, very little. Yet you have to really dig deep to find what the changes are. One of the big changes, if you can call it big, is they've changed the term contracts to agreements. And that's because there are more agreements than there are physical hard signed contracts. You can have an agreement, a verbal agreement, stuff like that. Very, very minor changes. They've moved some information around within the first process called Plan Procurement Management, just to make sure that it aligns. Conducting procurements, they've added this thing called a procurement statement of work. And what that really is helping to provide suppliers with clearly stated goals, requirements, outcomes, so they can provide you with a quantifiable response to, say, a RFP or an RFI or an RFQ. The other 2 processes, which are controlling procurements and closing procurements, other than a title change to one of them, no real changes at all. Very simple.
Project stakeholder management is a new area for project management. It's a major change. What is this knowledge area, and how does it change what we do?
You're absolutely right. Project stakeholder management is a brand new area. It is the first new knowledge area introduced into the PMBOK in over 20 years. At least I can go back as far as the 1996 version of the PMBOK, and there has been no new knowledge area. But as you can see from the title and what it's talking about, this aligns with the current trends that soft skills are vitally important to the successful project manager. So let's take a look at what each of these 4 areas, there are 4 processes in this knowledge area. The first process is identify stakeholders. Well, you should be familiar with this one because this used to be in project communications management. And the output of this is a stakeholder register. The next process is called plan stakeholder management. Like we've seen throughout this entire video series, PMI has introduced this plan something management into each of the knowledge areas to identify a subsidiary plan to the PMP, or the project management plan. And this process here is really to provide a clear and actionable plan to interact with your project stakeholders to support your project's interest. And the output here is a stakeholder management plan. No surprise there, but it is a new process. The third process in stakeholder management is around managing stakeholder engagement. This is similar to the 4th edition's process called managing stakeholder expectations. But PMI has added much more on the soft skills. Again, here's a common theme. But the soft skills they've talked about here are your interpersonal skills, communications methods, and your management skills that are needed to be able to manage and maintain the engagement and enthusiasm of your stakeholders. Which leads us to the final one, control stakeholder engagement. Again, they've titled it to align with the rest of the activities or processes within the monitoring and controlling process group. But in this particular activity, where they're talking control stakeholder engagement, it is to maintain and increase the efficiency and effectiveness of your stakeholders' engagement activities as the project evolves and changes. So you can see, project stakeholder management is a new area, but a lot of it has already been established and identified within the PMBOK before.
Wow! PMI has made quite a few changes. How big are the changes to the PMBOK for us practitioners and for those who are getting ready to take the exam?
That's a really good question, and you hit the nail on the head to separate it out for practitioners from those who are studying for the exam. So let's focus on the practitioner first. Most of the changes I think are pretty good. They're going to help us do our job better, they're logical, and they make sense. And PMI did a pretty good job at making the PMBOK a bit more user-friendly and a bit more readable. Of course, the biggest change is the addition of the project stakeholder management knowledge area, but even a lot of that information was already in the PMBOK before. It's just increasing the content around something we've already done. The part that I really like is that PMI has really advanced the alignment between the PMBOK and the standards for program management and the standard for portfolio management, as well as working with ISO on the new ISO standard 21500 that was released last October. All of that really begins to align, and it's really going to help us do our job better. And for those of you who've taken an ESI course already, we've been teaching a lot of this information already because A, it's been out there, and B, it's best practice. So practitioners, the changes are pretty big, but not earth-shattering. Now let's take a look at those of you who are studying for your credential. They're huge. The changes are really large. Almost every graphic has changed from a little to a total replacement. So if you're studying for the exam and you need to memorize, and you've been memorizing the 4th edition, the 5th edition is going to be brand new. There's a significant number, and I'm talking above 75% of the glossary terms have had some kind of vocabulary change to them. Again, as you're learning the vocabulary to be able to pass the test, that's a really big change. Now, each of the process groups has a key purpose, and those key purposes describe what the process group is about. They weren't there before, so that's a great place to get another test question or two. Again, a larger change. Now, each of the 47 processes also has a key benefit. Again, a beautifully testable area. So, for those studying for the credential, pay attention. The 5th edition is quite a bit different than the 4th edition. And for those of you who are going for your exam, keep in mind that as of July 1st, 2013, the Certified Associate Project Management CAPM exam changes over to the 5th edition on the 1st of July. The end of July, that's the 31st of July, the PMP and the PGMP change over to their next editions, or to the 5th edition. On the 31st of August, the final 2 credentials move over to the 5th edition of the PMBOK. That would be the PMI Scheduling Professional and the PMI Risk Management Professional. So again, those dates, the CAPM is the 1st of July, the PMP and the PGMP are the 31st of July, and the Scheduling Professional and the Risk Management Professional change over on August 31st. The ACP, or the Agile Certified Practitioner exam, is not changing at this time. PMI may change their mind on that, but that's not changing at this time. So keep in mind that until those changeover dates, PMI is not doing your grandfathering. So before those dates, it's going to be the 4th edition. After those dates, it's the 5th edition. No exceptions. So make sure you study and prepare beforehand if you're going to take it on the 4th edition. Make sure you study and prepare for the 5th edition, and don't take the exam before the 31st, or before the rollover date. okay? If you are going for your exam, I wish you the absolute best of luck out there, and keep in touch.